Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In this bonus author interview, I sit down with Professor Moshik Temkin, and we talk about his most recent work, Warriors, Rebels, and Saints, the Art of Leadership from Machiavelli to Malcolm X. I really enjoyed the book. It's a little bit different from a lot of the hard-hitting history that we usually do on the program. This one's a lot more political science, but sometimes I think it's fun to do something that's a little bit different. If you're listening to this right now, the book is out and it's available. It's excellent. He covers a variety of different case studies of leadership from people who have a great deal of power, United States presidents, for example, and people who don't have a great deal of power, those working in the French Resistance, by example. It clocks in at just under 300 pages. I found it a very enjoyable read. I think it'd make an excellent holiday present for somebody that you know that's interested in maybe one of the great leaders of history or would just like to learn a little bit more about the subject. As always, the link to purchase the book is in the show notes, as are the links to the website for the podcast and the Patreon page. If you would like to listen to the show without ads, that's $1 a month. $2 a month gets you access to a lot of other bonus content, and the options go up from there. As always, this show only exists because of the support from the people who make it happen. So without further ado then, on to the interview. And welcome back to the podcast. As I mentioned before, I'm sitting down with author Moshik Temkin, and we're talking about his most recent book, Warriors, Rebels, and Saints, talking about the idea of leadership and how leadership can come in a lot of different forms and doesn't necessarily perhaps always match the archetypes that we might imagine, though sometimes it does. It's an excellent book, and I wanted to dig into some of the examples that you use as you're writing, because I think they're illustrative both for Western civilization and just sort of in general. You begin with the Bible as a source of leadership examples, and I think it's useful to start here, not only because that's where the book starts, but because also, I think when a lot of listeners think of, well, what are sort of archetypal leadership styles that we're going to get out of the Bible? Most people are probably going to go to Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, right off the gate. But I'm not sure that that's correct. You start with King David, who's a very different model of leadership. And I thought you could talk about that for a little bit, because what David teaches us about leadership is, I think, a little bit different from somebody who we would expect to meet in Scripture.
Yeah, so first, thanks for having me, and thanks for the kind words, and I'm glad to be here. And thanks for that interesting question. So I do start with the Bible, and I use the example of King David, not to just speak generally about King David, but if you recall, there's a specific episode in his life that comes it comes after the whole trajectory of him coming from a very modest background, right? He's a shepherd boy who is then anointed to become the king, and he defeats Goliath, David and Goliath, and then eventually becomes the king, and God loves him and tells him that his house will be kings in perpetuity. And in fact, we know that according to Jewish and Christian theology, the Messiah is supposed to come from the line of King David. So that's supposedly where Jesus Christ comes from. He's a descendant of King David. But the story I start with happens after he's already succeeded as a king. He's won wars of conquest, and now he's a very wealthy and powerful king sitting in his palace, and that's when he commits a sin. He commits the sin in the eyes of the Lord. The Bible tells us, the Old Testament, and the sin is what he did in order to become to make Bathsheba his wife, which is the death of the planned death of her husband Uriah the Hittite, who is a soldier in David's army, fighting a war, and David arranges for Uriah the Hittite to die, to be killed in battle, so that he can cover up what he did with Bathsheba and then have a child with her. And the Bible tells us that the Lord is very displeased with King David and his acts, and he sends the prophet Nathan to tell him that he committed a terrible sin for which he will not die, but he will be punished. And the punishment will come out of his own house. And then we have these shocking episodes of murder and rape and incest and rebellion of his own son against him. And it ends with the death of his son Absalom, to make a long story short. And this episode of the Bible is very shocking, very traumatic, and very dramatic. But I was always, I had learned this as a very young child, and then I've been teaching it also for many years as part of my coursework. And I always wondered, why is this in the Bible? Why are they telling us these horrific stories about King David, who is such an important figure? Well, the message here is that even an all-powerful king, a leader, has some accountability, has some constraint on his power. And in the Bible, this is represented by God, who we can substitute as a kind of form of morality. And the biblical author is telling us that even the Almighty King cannot do whatever he wants to do. There is a higher power that constrains him. And I think that sets the tone for my overall approach to understanding leadership. That we look at individuals, we look at what used to be known as, great men, but we have to understand them not as all-powerful, just doing whatever they want, but we have to understand them as operating within structures, within constraints, within opposition, within other forms of authority. And then afterwards, that takes a turn, because if we move to a world that is not just according to the Bible, but is a more secular world, those constraints take other forms. Right? We don't just understand it as a higher power constraining, but we understand it as structures and systems and institutions and people and politics and ideology and material concerns and all kinds of things that serve to constrain the leader. So that's a kind of an important reason why I begin with King David. The other is because we all have ideas in our minds about what a leader is, who a leader is, what a leader looks like. And I even start my classes on leadership with that exercise. I ask everybody in the class to think of a leader, just the first person who pops into their head. And it's very interesting, the kind of names that they come up with, because those names come from somewhere. Right? Anybody who enters a class on leadership or even begins to read my book on leadership is already going to have preconceptions about who a leader is, what a leader is. And those ideas come from our common cultural foundations. And our common cultural foundations are often mythological, right? And that's why the Bible is a very good example for me of a kind of source for how we even begin to think about leaders in our world.
Well, I think you make a lot of good points there. And, one of the points that I always discuss on my podcast is I don't think the words, absolute monarchy or absolute authority do us a lot of good sometimes when analyzing, even if we're talking about classical history, antiquity, late antiquity, or into the medieval period, because of the idea of constraints that you bring up. Obviously, David is sort of checked by the ultimate constraint in this case. But as I've constantly tried to ram home in the podcast, there's not a lot of instances in history where you can point to someone and say, this person has 100% absolute authority in a given situation. Whether we're talking about a medieval king, he's usually ruling with consent of landed nobility and other powerful people. And if he acts outside the bonds of what is expected of, and I tend to use male pronouns when we're talking about this period because that's typical for the period. That's not to be taken in any other context. But the reality is it is the moment that monarch loses a major battle, all of those morality foibles are going to come to the top and become excuses for getting rid of this person. And so the idea that great and powerful leaders, can do whatever they want, and Louis the 14th can declare himself to be the state is a lot of times that just doesn't match the reality of what we're talking about here. And that's kind of a good way to transition to the next thinker, which is usually when I bring up early politics to students, the name that they do know is Niccolo Machiavelli. That's the name that they've heard of because he's the better feared than loved guy, which isn't actually a perfect quotation, but that's who they think of, and he is important. I'm not saying he's not, and so I just kind of want to start by pulling at what do we get from Machiavelli? Like, what do we honestly get from him and some people argue he writes the first treatise in Western civilization on on sort of how you should be a politician. There's arguments about that, but what should we take away from him as a thinker if we think about Machiavelli?
Yeah, so for me, the first thing I want to say is that I am not an expert as such on Machiavelli. I write about Machiavelli in this book in the context of trying to analyze the way we as humans, as a human society, have tried to think about leadership over time. So there is certainly a transition that happens over a long period of time between a kind of, you can call it religious / theological / mythological understanding of leadership, as in the case of King David, right? And this lasts for hundreds of years because the example that you gave of Louis XIV is a really good example. Your analysis is absolutely correct. Louis XIV is basically he's the top aristocrat among aristocrats. That's really what a king is in Europe. But he reigns with their sort of consent, as it were, and it's always conditioned on a certain degree of mutual success and thriving and so on and so forth. And we know that, but we also know that the idea behind a monarchy in Europe is not very different from the idea behind King David's monarchy, which is that the king is also there by the grace of God. So that's why in not only medieval Europe, even the early modern period, if you think about, Henry VIII, the worst possible crime was regicide. Not just because the king is important and the king is the ruler, but because you're committing a grave sin against God herself, right? And so you have those two levels at the same time. You have the political, material, economic, social basis for monarchy and for a king, but you also have the fact that any king of this sort, Louis XIV, Henry, whoever you want to pick, all the way back to King David and before, is also a kind of representative and is there as a choice and the anointed figure for God. And so that is part of the story and the foundation of the monarchical system. I think what Machiavelli does, and to understand his importance, it's not just to look at the text, but to understand it in the moment that he's writing. He's still writing. This is the early 16th century. He's still writing in a moment in which the idea is that a ruler, a prince that he writes about, or a king, or what have you, is ruling through the grace of higher power. And higher power plays a significant role in determining whether a ruler will be successful or not, and whether the ruler is protected or not. Machiavelli, what he does is he still reserves a certain place. He's not an atheist. He's reserving a certain place for fortune, what he calls fortune, which really sort of means God in that sense. But he's also saying something very significant, which is that the ruler himself can make their own destiny, that they have power to control their fate, whether they succeed or whether they fail, depends on actions that they take that have nothing to do with morality as represented by God or morality in general. That it's a much more strategic / secular way of thinking about power and about the ruler. Now, as such, political theorists have written mountains of books on this topic, and I'm not a political theorist. What interested me here was entering into the very long-standing debate, or maybe it's not that long-standing. I kind of use it as a hook for my own book, which is, does the leader make history, or does history make the leaders? Okay, so I see Machiavelli and Machiavelli's writing as an important, or actually probably the most important foundational text, at least in the West, for the idea that leader makes history, that individual leaders with what we now call agency, and that's not a word that existed in his era, determines what happens to his people, but especially to his own rule, whether or not he's going to be a success or a failure. And so I think Machiavelli for me, is not the end-all be-all. In fact, I'm skeptical of his conclusions because anyone who takes a look at the book will see that I'm kind of torn on this issue. I don't think that it's just about the individual leader being a genius or a success or a failure, but it's about the structures and the constraints and the situations that any leader needs to confront. And for that, we need to look at other thinkers, maybe some who come after Machiavelli, who give us a completely different perspective on this question.
And I think it's always worth pointing out, as I try to students, that these authors are writing in a historical context. And, Machiavelli is writing at a time when he hopes someone is going to unite Italy in a way that it's going to be able to stand up against some of the emerging early modern states in Europe in the way that it can't at the moment as it's fractured. And you kind of talk about, Machiavelli moving a little bit away from morality as this gauge for leadership, which of course he has to do because his example of a good leader oftentimes is a gentleman by the name of Cesare Borgia, who's not moral. I guess that's sort of that'd be the understatement of that particular century. He's a sociopath in a lot of ways. But I think it's interesting because now I want to transition. I want to talk about FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because he's one of the examples that you pull up, and because I'm torn on that question too of does the leader make history or does history make the leader? And the reason that I'm torn on that is like pull up, if you're at home right now and you're at your computer, you can pull up the top 10 list of American presidents right now. And what you'll notice by looking at the list is that the top ones have one thing in common, which is usually they're faced by some sort of crisis. Calvin Coolidge, who, is president during the Roaring 20s, things are going pretty well for a lot of people. He's not high on the list. So it's a question that I have, but so FDR is confronted, of course, by this problem immediately we call the Great Depression in the United States, and he responds very differently, as you point out, than Herbert Hoover, who is his preceding president, and in a lot of ways he changes what it means to be the president of the United States. So first of all, why does Roosevelt confront this issue differently, and what is it that makes him maybe uniquely able to see the Depression in a different light compared to someone who came before him? Because I think, as you point out correctly in the book, like he's got some unique attributes here that you really need to understand.
Yeah, I think you set that up nicely. The way to, for me, a crucial way to even begin to understand FDR as a president and as a leader is to first take a look at Herbert Hoover, his predecessor. And in fact, that juxtaposition for me tells a big part of the story. I mean, remember, Herbert Hoover actually is not like Coolidge in the sense that when Coolidge had been the governor of Massachusetts, he was a kind of a Republican politician, almost a sort of generic politician of his era, conservative politician of his era. Herbert Hoover is something special. Herbert Hoover had never been elected to public office. He's not a career politician. He's elected on the basis of an extraordinary CV. He's not even like some glib businessman who's talking smack on TV, that being a troll online. It's not that sort of thing. He's an accomplished public servant. In our day, we would call him, I guess, a very successful technocrat. Even they didn't use that term back then, but that's really what he is. And as an entrepreneur, as a humanitarian who was able to figure out how to prevent people from starving in Europe after World War I, and he also, interestingly, he comes from a modest background, right? He grows up in sort of this little place in Iowa. He pulls himself up by his bootstraps, to use a terrible American cliche, right? But so when he's elected in 1928, he's a widely admired figure. And then if you just skip forward to when he leaves office the end of 1932, he's the least popular president in American history until George W. Bush breaks his record when 2008 when he leaves office. So that's a long time to hold a record for being the least popular president. So how does that happen? We have to explain this fall and this collapse. So the Great Depression, right? The collapse of Wall Street. Now, we learn from the example of Hoover that he is the kind of leader, if you will, or president in this case, that is the right kind of person to have when times are stable, relatively stable, when there's peace, when there's no real crisis to face. But when crisis does hit, it turns out that Hoover, who is an excellent manager, it's just the wrong man at the wrong place for the wrong job, and you need a different kind of leader. And the American people also determined that he's not the leader that they need. He reacted to the collapse almost with a kind of denialism, right? That it's much smaller than it actually is. That he said prosperity is just around the corner, and as millions of people are completely destroyed, they look at their leader saying prosperity is just around the corner, and their reaction is, what in the world are you talking about? Prosperity is clearly not just around the corner. You have utterly lost touch with the needs of the American people. And so now enter FDR, who comes from the complete opposite. Comes from the Hudson Valley, as does his wife Eleanor. They're American aristocrats. They grew up in great privilege. He spends most of his early life coasting on his great last name. Because he's the distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, and he, goes to Harvard, and he's a mediocre student at Harvard, but he decides very early on that he's destined for great things, seemingly based on very little. Now, between then and the time that he becomes president, he did some things. He was a pretty successful governor of New York. He had been in the Wilson administration, Secretary of the Navy, so he wasn't a nobody. But a lot of people still considered him kind of a lightweight, and as someone who, because of his background, couldn't possibly understand what Americans were going through. Most Americans were going through. But it turned out, for reasons that are not always easy to explain, because they're not always clear to the eye, that FDR was the kind of person who could understand a crisis like this, was able to respond to what at least most Americans, overwhelming majority of Americans, thought that they needed and wanted from a leader in that kind of crisis. And we also have to understand, you probably know this, people today in the United States still underestimate or don't understand just how bad that crisis was, how bad the Great Depression was. We read about it, the Great Depression. And it's one thing also to look at numbers, right? What does it mean to have 25% official unemployment? Right? What does it mean when you have that level of social disintegration? Right? Well, FDR understood what it means is what happened in Europe. What happened in Europe was the rise of fascism and the increasing popularity of communism, and the sense that the capitalist system was failing. The democratic liberal democracy was certainly failing. And it looked like the two countries that were ascendant, in particular in the 1930s, as same time that FDR takes office, were Stalinist Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So he understands the link between economic collapse, social disintegration, and political extremism, and he understands the threats to the system. And I think that he was not in denial about these problems. He was not in denial about the links between people's economic and material needs and their political behavior. He was not in denial about what the priorities were for a leader at that time. It wasn't just to protect institutions or to protect sort of, what traditionally a president was supposed to protect, but really to think about the needs of the people first and foremost. And that made him very popular with a lot of Americans because of what he did, but it also made him a very unpopular with other Americans, as you probably know, because a lot of people looked at FDR at this time, and during the entire time that he was president, he was elected 4 times in landslides, and said this man is almost a dictator. This man is sort of not even, is not respecting the institutional arrangements of a liberal democracy in his ruthlessness, in the way that he fiercely protected the New Deal and his political agenda, and then later in the way that he waged World War II, because that was also quite an effort, a mobilizing effort, which was controversial among many. So I think that's where you see the difference between leaders who are kind of appropriate for stability, peacetime, that's a Herbert Hoover, but who failed during a crisis, versus a leader who is successful during a crisis. And we, as you point out, we remember that leader. We tend to remember that leader because it's really a crisis in which people are most attentive to the kind of leadership they have, in which they seek leadership at the most basic level to protect them, right, to help them. And it's also the time in which we are most susceptible, and I'm using the royal we are most susceptible to the kind of leaders that in history turn out also to be the most dangerous, the most homicidal, the most murderous, the most ideological.
Yeah, it's very true. Sometimes I think some of the greatest leaders in history, and I mean world history when I say that, not just American history, are people who can just see something that other people can't yet. And they pull it into being. And that's very much, if anybody who's at home right now, you wouldn't really identify the American state prior to FDR. It would be hard because it's so much smaller. There's no Social Security. The idea of the government sort of intervening in the economy was just foreign. And that's and I think, it's no knock on Herbert Hoover, by the way. Like I do, like sometimes students will say, well, he just didn't care. No, he cares. He cared a lot. Like we talk about the rescue efforts and the efforts that he led to get food, to Russia in the midst of that civil war. That's kind of at the dovetailing with the end of World War I. There, saves millions of lives. But critically, that was a private enterprise. That was something that he was able to fundraise. And that's what he saw as that's going to pull us out of World War II again. The government will give money to the Red Cross, will give money to these things, and that's what will save us. He simply didn't understand that that tool wasn't going to work anymore. And that's the difference between Herbert Hoover and FDR. But you're right. There are a lot of people. I mean, a lot of people still who hate FDR. There are a lot of people who see him as making a lot of mistakes. I mean, he came 2 minutes away from packing more Supreme justices on the United States Supreme Court, which would not have been taken well at all. But I want to transition because I want to talk in the book. You talk about the French resistance in World War II. And the reason I thought that this was really interesting is that it's easy for us a lot of times to identify leaders who have power. But how do you lead when you don't have power, I think is a totally different question and is a much more difficult ask in a lot of ways. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that story and how it is illustrative of how do you try to fix something when there's nothing in your toolbox?
Right. So I think a lot of people who will pick up any book on leadership, hopefully they'll pick up my book on leadership, but if, any book that they pick up on leadership, the most common frame for it, whether it's in they're walking through the business section or they're walking in the biography section, is about individuals. And I guess great. Sometimes it's women, but it's more often men. Great, great men, and it could be not that they're all good, but sometimes that they're not good. But depending on who's looking at it, but it's all about their their abilities and sort of their qualities and their characteristics that allows them to forge their way and to change the world, right, for better or worse, what have you. So that's really the context in which I set out to write my book and to even start thinking about leadership in a serious way in the first place, is to look at the different ways that we need to understand leaders. It's not always people at the head of a big, powerful state. It's sometimes leaders have some power. For example, if you look at the leaders of the civil rights movement in the United States, right? They have some power. They have they have things that help them become visible. They have an important cause. They have followers. They might have media. They might have some money. They have things like that, but they don't have the ultimate power, which is an army or in institutions of the state, or let alone being a king or a dictator. Then you have even a third layer, which is where do you look for leadership when you have absolutely no power, and not only do you have no power, you actually have the powers that be who are trying to destroy you, trying to kill you, trying to imprison you. So the French resistance in World War II is an excellent example. The stakes were simply if you resisted. This isn't the resistance in the symbolic sense. Oh, I'm in the resistance against some president or something. This is the resistance, meaning if you resist, you will be dead. And in fact, people who went into the French resistance, not at the end of the war when everybody was in the French resistance, but at the beginning of the war or in the middle of the war, they assumed that they would die. They assumed that they would be tortured by the Gestapo and be killed. That was the work. And then you get the sort of people who would join a movement knowing that or assuming they're going to die. And just, you can only imagine what kind of people do that. It's not, people who have a lot to lose. It's sometimes people who have very little to lose or feel an existential need to resist, right? And later that changes. So I've always been fascinated at looking at leadership in those kinds of situations, because if you look around the world, you see that contrary to how we live, there are a lot of people who are in exactly or similar kind of situation. They are living without rights. They're living in oppression. They have no real institutional power, and they're in danger. And so how do you lead in that kind of situation? I wanted to examine that question by looking at the example of the French resistance.
Yeah, and I think that there's just interesting takeaways from that, because we always talk about the leaders who are sort of transformational figures, and we think of big business figures and so on and so forth. But then you start to think about the people who are leaders in a context in which they are almost certain to die, and sort of the focus changes a little bit. If we think about World War II, then there's another part of the book that I thought was really interesting, and that's when you talk about. I'm not sure if the twin decision makes sense, but the decisions that go into the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and the decision to drop the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how I don't want to say inevitable, but the decisions start to almost drive themselves at some point. And I want to start to talk first about Pearl Harbor, because I think if you want to talk about strategy versus tactics, you could say tactically, okay, maybe it was a sound decision, but strategically to engage in a war with the United States, almost every book that I've read on it, military observers will say that was a mistake. That was a mistake on the part of the Japanese leadership. So, and I have to imagine, and I imagined as I was reading the book, that the Japanese leadership is intelligent. They know what they're doing. It's an interesting political situation where the decisions come from the emperor, and we don't really know what goes into the black box. It just kind of comes out. So what does the decision to make that attack in December 1941 on Pearl Harbor, what does that tell us about leadership specific to that situation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So let's again compare that This was actually a very hard chapter for me to write, because that chapter in World War II, because we're really talking about some of the worst moments in history, right? The destructiveness, the death. It's easy to be just statistical about it or analytical about it. That's hard for me, because you're just confronted with what it took, right? What that war actually entailed, and ultimately what won the war. Right, the price that we, not just, of course, the victims paid, but also we as humanity, right? When you really think about it, and in that sense, I think even the film that we all saw over the summer, Oppenheimer, raised some of those questions. I didn't think it did a 100%, raised all the questions, but it did sort of touch on some of these issues of what it actually means to win a war like that, right? So the resistance, the French resistance. Ultimately, they're not going to win the war. Their struggle is almost a symbolic one, in which you're thinking about the long term and being able to say, I did everything I could to fight this in real time. I took a stand. And after the war, it's not an accident that the French resistance and their leader, Charles de Gaulle, became the foundation for the leadership of the new France, right? Because that was what they could build around, right? As saying, these are the people who didn't collaborate with the Nazis, right? And so that's the real meaning of the resistance over time. But the resistance can't win a war like that. To win a war like that, you need what the Manhattan Project did, and you need total war, and you need millions and millions of soldiers of the United States Army, and in particular, it must be said, of the Red Army, the Soviet Union, fighting in Europe to liberate Eastern Europe, which saw the worst fighting of World War II, to win that war. So that's an important separation. Now, when we get to Pearl Harbor, it's a fascinating thing. Japan. Yes, if you kind of in a cursory look at World War II on TV, movies, popular culture, books. So one day out of the blue, these lunatics from Japan just attacked us at Pearl Harbor. And of course, that brought an indifferent America into the war eventually, and led to the end of the war and the triumph of good over evil, and this narrative that we all have, which is not entirely unjustified, I want to say, but it's of course very superficial. But then when you actually look at the history of Japan, you see that it has a long history. The Pearl Harbor is a sort of like an endpoint of a very long process. When you actually look at that process, one of the things that puzzled me is that I found it very hard to identify clear leadership in this whole buildup. There's no one figure that, let's say in Germany we have Hitler, or in the Soviet Union we have Lenin, and then Stalin. There's no Britain. We can say, oh, there's Churchill, and all these names that come up. Who is the leader in Japan? It turns out Japan itself is what happens in Japan, it should be said, is itself the product of a historical process, and you just have to be rigorous about this. And you say, well, it's it starts in the 19th century with the opening up of Japan and the beginning of Japan's imperial turn and the building up of Japan's empire, which was modeled on Western empires. And then they learned all their techniques and military techniques and even their industrialization and their economic organization and their political reforms from Western imperial powers like Prussia, like Britain, like France, like the United States. And they arrive at a situation where they see themselves as having dominion over East Asia and the Pacific. And the momentum carries them to a more extreme imperial and militaristic position to the point where, of course, they threaten the United States. At least the American leaders feel threatened by Japanese power in the Pacific, and the hostility grows to the point where the blockade and the fuel shortage that is imposed by the United States puts the Japanese leadership in a kind of panic. The American demand that Japan exit China is a fascinating one to me. Now, the United States really had very little leg to stand on in demanding that other people, get out of places and stop behaving in an aggressive way and stop invading. But on its face, it's a legitimate demand. China is a sovereign country. Japan has no business invading China and occupying China, right? But the Japanese reaction to this demand, it's as if they were asked the most outlandish thing in the world. It's a non-starter for them. And when I saw that, I said, "Oh, this is odd. How do you get to a point as leadership where your presence as an occupying power in another sovereign country is seen as this outrageous demand and a non-starter? Well, how do you get to that point?" So I started digging even deeper and looking at the transcripts of their decision making to actually bomb Pearl Harbor. Now, I went into this expecting originally, because I'm not a Japan historian, I thought, well, I'm going to find that these people are completely insane. They're raving about Japanese greatness and how the gods will protect them and who knows what. Instead, I found rational, technical discussions, the kind that you would find in any policymaking circle. And they actually knew the Americans had material and human advantages. They knew that they were not stupid. They were not detached from the reality. They knew they had to win fast. But they got to a point where they had put themselves in a situation that would eventually lead to their own disaster and their own collapse. And so I just found this fascinating. How do rational leaders and policymakers get to a situation where they are at the source of their own disaster? And it was a disaster. In the short term, it was a success, as you point out. But once the United States, gets its act together and then gets into the war machine that the United States built and used in the Pacific, culminating, of course, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was not something that Japan could counter.
Yeah, and I there is a really important point here that I want to make before we talk a little bit about the decision to drop the atomic weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that is that when leaders make decisions, sometimes and this ties into LBJ, who we might get a chance to talk about as well, they're not making a decision with all options on the table. And I think that's important to recognize, because the key that you point out there is that Japan had put itself into a position by 1941, facing embargoes, while simultaneously trying to feed its imperial ambitions in China and Southeast Asia, where Pearl Harbor actually looks like, at least in the short term, the best choice. And it is successful. And to an extent, to be fair to Japan, they actually get a little unlucky on the day, on December 7th, because it's either one or two of the aircraft carriers happen to be away on that day. And had they been there, it would have been almost the complete destruction of the Pacific Fleet. So America gets a little lucky, Japan gets a little unlucky there. But before we get too harsh in evaluating some of these decisions, and maybe this is relevant in Hiroshima as well, just remember that there's no you don't have every choice on the table every single time. These are hard choices that leaders have to make, and that's why we judge them as such. That now the Hiroshima Nagasaki decision, I think, is interesting because FDR passes away, and Truman is told shortly thereafter, "Your congratulations, your president. Well, also, we should tell you about this," which he didn't know. Going into it, I didn't know, which is insane to think about. And so he has to make this decision, and the military structure has to make this decision about what are we going to do with this. And they're facing, this projection of appalling losses to continue an invasion of Japan. And I should point out, and other military historians have point this out, the bombs that are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those aren't the first incendiaries dropped on Japan throughout the course of the war. Curtis LeMay, the famous American Air Corps general, has been viciously bombing the mainland of Japan for a long time, to tremendous loss of life. But this is something new. And this is something that we don't know what necessarily the outcome is going to be. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about the decision to ultimately drop those weapons and what that tells us a little bit about another type of leadership.
This is a case for me in which it's, you can look at episodes in which you clearly identify who the leader is and who is making a big decision. Or you can talk about individuals versus the constraints that they face, and so on and so forth. Here, the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is very difficult for a number of reasons. One of them is because I do not know who the leader was in this instance. So you're right, you point out Harry Truman has to officially, formally give the order. But as you point out, he didn't know about he didn't order the development of the atomic weaponry. That's FDR. And FDR didn't initiate the development of atomic weaponry. That was the Germans. Nazi Germany was starting to work on it beforehand. And the United States didn't actually start this war, right? The Germans and the Japanese started this war. And the historical process that led to the war is a very long one, stretches back decades, if not centuries. So I guess the point I'm making is the history here is put in momentum long before Harry Truman was even born, let alone become president or a vice president, let alone FDR dying and Truman finding himself with this, with these atomic bombs in his hand. So it's not enough to just look at Truman. There's a whole history here. Now, is it Mr. Oppenheimer, Dr. Oppenheimer? Well, I mean, he's a fascinating case study because it's part of the story of the total war, right? The entire scientific, technological, and intellectual know-how of this power, the United States, is mobilized for the war effort. And the Manhattan Project is the culmination of this. Well, that's an important part of the story, but I don't know if they're the leaders here. Is it Curtis LeMay? Point out Curtis LeMay. It's his command under which the bombing happened. Is it the pilot? The pilot, Paul Tibbets. He has to decide. Think about it. He's not a robot. It's a human being. Anyone who goes to war has to make that decision, at least formally. I'm actually going to do this. I'm going to get in my plane with an atomic bomb, and I'm going to drop it on this city. So I don't know. I don't know who the leader is now. But then we're looking at this incredible destructiveness. Who's responsible? Were the Japanese responsible themselves for what happened to their country? You could make that argument, but what is the connection between the children who were incinerated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japanese leaders who decades before had decided to invade China or years before had decided to attack Pearl Harbor? It's only the accident of birth, right? So I don't know. It's not the Japanese people who are responsible for their own deaths at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in fact, as you point out, again, the firebombing of Japanese cities killed more people than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, although the type of destructiveness is different. And there's a line here that is being crossed, and a lot of people have written about that. So I think for me, this chapter in particular was part of it was trying to really kind of dissect where to identify the leadership, who is the leader that we need to talk about, but also to say, well, we also have situations in which leaders are caught up in a momentum that is far more powerful than they are. And in fact, they have too much power. They have so much power that they can't control it. Truman is that sort of leader for me here, because he's not really in a position to say no. The die had already been cast, as it were. Too much had happened by the time that he becomes president. So I think part of the lesson for us is, and I'm not saying it's very hard to say now, it was a good idea to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki or not. I think for me, it's just something that it's something that happened in history, and we have to understand the end of World War II as a sort of linked with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but at what price? Right? When you actually think about what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how do we even get to a situation where, in order to win a war, we are even considering the development of such weapons and then the use of such weapons on civilians, on children? That's a question that I know is hard to answer, but I think it's a question we need to pose nonetheless.
Well, I agree with you, by the way. I think that Truman was in a position that he simply wasn't going to be able to say no for a number of reasons. We know that politically he's thinking about voter backlash domestically. If they find out that he had this weapon and he didn't use it, and maybe it does cost 1 million men, politically he's looking at the Soviet Union and thinking about what is this going to look like after the end of the war, because these are two powers who are already drifting apart at this point. War makes for strange bedfellows, but when the war is over, this is clearly going to be an us versus them scenario. So we have those two things going on right there. And I agree with you that it's so hard to sit now and say, well, was it a good decision to drop the atomic weapon for a couple reasons? First of all, I don't like historical what ifs because we don't know what would have happened. Okay, let's say we just keep going for a while. We just keep firebombing for a bit. We have to start to invade, and then we have to drop the bombs anyway. And now, we killed another 50,000 people on top of the people who are going to be killed by the atomic bomb. Or, we do a land invasion. We lose hundreds of thousands of people as a result of that. And civilians are still brutalized. I don't know how you figure out which way it could have come out. But I agree with you that the other thing to think about is, and we're all thinking about it right now in the world because of what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in Gaza, is this question of proportionality, which is, what do you do when leaders are making decisions, but other people are suffering the consequences? And it's such a difficult conversation to have. And I certainly don't have the answers to those sorts of things.
Yeah, no, those are hard questions. Sorry that we're talking about such a gloomy topic, but I think the risk that we run, and it's not just a risk, it's actually happening, and it certainly happened in World War II, and it's happening now, I think, is the risk of dehumanizing other humans. World War II is a war of dehumanization, and it's not one-sided. So it starts even with a Nazi dehumanization of the Jewish people, but also of Slavs, and a kind of, this insane racist ideology biological racist ideology that they develop, that is at the source of why they decide to launch this war in the first place. And the Japanese aren't too far behind. They have a very racist conception of other Asian peoples, and that is supposedly for their need to protect those Asian peoples from the nefarious Western colonial powers that would threaten Asia. And so Japanese ideology is also at the root of this. Once the war begins, it escalates to the point where mutual dehumanization is at its core. And I ask myself if you can actually drop firebombs on people that you consider to be like yourself. And if you can drop atomic weapons on people that you consider to be like yourself, that you can recognize yourself in them, right? Members of your family or your friends or your community. We know from scholarship like, John Dower's very important work on, War Without Mercy on the Pacific War. We know that racism and racist ideology was at the heart of the U.S.-Japanese war, mutually speaking. And we know, how important it was even for the way that the Nazis conceived of why they were going to war in the first place. But we have to be honest with ourselves. And we have to be honest that in order to make that kind of rationale to say, in order to win a war, I must drop this horrible weapon on a city that has, let's say, 100,000 or 200,000 civilians, including children, in order to win the war. By that stage, I have dehumanized my enemy to the point where I don't even make any distinction between combatants and civilians, right? And that is a legacy of World War II that we have not shaken, that we have, in a sense, normalized, unfortunately. We haven't used atomic weapons since then. I think part of it is because of what people understood about the meaning of it. I don't think Truman understood what an atomic weapon really was until after it happened, right? But we now know what it is, right? But the fact that we see now, just by turning on the news, that mutually, it's not just one side, mutually, that in order to win a military or political struggle that you're involved in, you're willing to kill, even massacre civilians. Well, then we're talking not just about a war, we're talking about dehumanization. And for me, part of the lesson of leadership in history is to be aware of that and to avoid that, and for leaders to be conscious of the essential humanity of everybody, including the people that they're supposedly, fighting a war against.
I do think that that's one of the critical lessons of history. I'm not sure, I think it's Martin Luther King has a quote to some extent of like, history is always sort of trending towards justice. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily always true in every given situation. I think sometimes there are regressions. But I mean, you're so right when you talk about the dehumanization of World War II. You look at the Western Front, Nazi Germany vis-a-vis Britain, France, like it's brutal, but there's some rules there. But on the Eastern Front, it is just massacring back and forth. There is no quarter whatsoever. It is, you do not recognize the other side as human beings at all. And I do mean at all. Like that's what's happening over there. And it is something that we have to pause and try to learn from. So let's try to end this optimistically. I want to jump to the epilogue because I'm really interested in the epilogue, which obviously you wrote before the incidents in Israel and Gaza took place, and hopefully don't change the optimistic ending here. And I'm curious, given all the challenges that our species faces, should we continue to be optimistic in our leaders? Should we continue to hope that our leaders are going to find ways to escape the problems that seem to exponentially compound themselves every time I turn around?
Yeah, it's interesting that you see the ending of the book as optimistic. I didn't think I was being optimistic. I thought I would use the word hopeful rather than optimistic, but I'll explain why. I think I'm naturally very pessimistic about the current leadership that we see. That is the actual leadership that many of us have. I won't say too much about current political leadership in the United States overall, the political class in the United States overall. My mother taught me that if you don't have anything good to say, better not say anything. So I'm going to adhere to that. And I don't have much more positive views on leadership that I'm seeing in other parts of the world, those who actually wield power right now, right? So this is when I do interviews, very often the most frustrating thing for the interviewer is often they ask me, so who are the leaders now that are good? Are very critical, and I can't point to one or two leaders that I think are role models for us all. But I will say this. I think that there are leaders out there that they're not necessarily already recognized official formal leaders who are at the heads of state, or that we say, the CEO of X company is the leader that I admire. I'm talking about potential leaders. I'm talking about future leaders. And that epilogue that you mentioned is just a few pages, is talking about the future. It's talking about the leaders that we hopefully will have in the future, because those are people that I see now in different contexts and places where I teach and places where I travel. I meet them, I talk to them, I encourage them, because I recognize them as potentially changing things for the better, recognizing real problems that we have, not fake problems, not just the problems that one faces as a leader in terms of having self-interest or short-term electoral interest or staying in power, but rather thinking about the problems that we have and facing them. And it can be the ongoing warfare and death and destruction that we're witnessing right now, but also long-term problems like the climate, which, again, it's sort of like now almost become banal. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. I think that we need leaders who actually do something about it and are able to understand that national interests should not take precedence over our own survival on the planet, and our overall well-being, and that there is something that is called the public good. It's real, the common good. It's a real thing. It's not a made-up thing. It's not make-believe, right? So I think that epilogue ends on a note of hope, because while I am very critical of the state of leadership that we have today in the world, I do see potential for much better leadership in the future.
And I think that is hopeful. And I think anyone, and we're both engaged in the practice of teaching and education in different ways, I think anybody who is inherently hopeful. Hopeful that the next generation, the rising leaders of the future, are going to do a better job. And I tell them that every single day. But thank you so much for coming on the show. I think this was a really illustrative education. It's an excellent book. I'm sure it's going to do very, very well. And there's obviously a lot we didn't get to. You can't cover this amount in an interview. And so I really would encourage anyone, as we start to turn towards the holidays now, if you're thinking of a gift for anyone who's politically oriented, historically oriented, or just interested in leadership, this would make a great gift.
Thank you. And let me second that. Yes, so there's the holiday season, but just think about how nice it would be to get a gift like this, to send a gift like this to someone, or even to get a gift like this for yourself, right? We all need some self-care. Why not? So this book would be an excellent gift. And it would also, I'm always excited to engage with readers on a serious note. If anybody who's listening to this, who reads this and has questions for me or wants to get in touch with me, reach out. Don't be shy. I love to engage with readers in this way and begin a dialogue with anybody who's interested. And I want to thank you for a great conversation. This is great.
Of course, thank you so much. This was really lovely.